Sisters History Podcast. Hi, my name is Sarah, and today we will be discussing the women at Yuma Territorial Prison during the late 19th to early 20th century. Located near the borders of California and Mexico sits the town of Yuma, Arizona. When thinking of Yuma as a city, think of the most stereotypical Western town. Ones you see in movies like Tombstone or The Good, Bad, and the Ugly. Now, along with that visualization, think of what the prison may have looked and felt like. It was an outdoor prison, so the climate varied at both extremes of very hot in the summers and cold in the winter. In the cells a prisoner would have been placed in were rather small, dark, in the outdoors, and it was filled with dirt. Now put yourselves in the shoes of a female inmate in these conditions. Most likely, you are the only female in general of all of the guards and the other fellow inmates whom are male. Because there was a lack of female facilities at the prison, you were placed in a cell that is used for solitary confinement. It was like this at Yuma Territorial Prison up until 1891, when they built the first facilities for women. For 16 years, the prison lacked facilities for women. That is about half the time the prison stayed open. But even then, women who came to the prison during the 33 years it was open, it was sparse. You may wonder why. Did the prison lack female inmates? Was it because statistically men commit crimes more than women? No, it was because historically speaking, there was a lack of women just in general in the surrounding area. This is all circumstantial. Not only was the desert environment have something to do with the lack of women, but it also was during the 19th to 20th century in the western United States, where typically men were the ones who made the trek west first. Now, let me remind you, this is during the time of westward expansion. So it was mostly a male-dominated area. It was a man's job to try and find opportunities or gold in the western United States during this time. But not only did you have that historical event going on, but also the aftermath of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which is the treaty that between the Mexico and United States when the United States acquired land after the war. And the surrounding area of Yuma, Arizona already borders Mexico. And way before the treaty, that land was Mexico. So many of its residents and the surrounding cities were Mexican citizens who decided to stay in their homes, which eventually became territory of the United States. So the high population of women in that surrounding area was mainly Hispanic. And we will see that in some of the inmates, such as Elena Estrada, Manuela Fimbres, and Maria Moreno. So what do these conditions have to do with the prison? Well, because of the lack of women in the area. When building Yuma Territorial Prison, women were not kept in mind because of how little their population was. So of course, looking at this from a business or government spending point of view, I can see why they only built facilities for men. If they built facilities for women, they would lose a lot of money because there wasn't that demand. No women was going to prison, and if there was, it's the very small of the population. Like, in the 33 years of operations at Yuma, of all the 3,000 inmates, only 28 of them were women. That is a long period of time for only 28 of the inmates to be women. Although I agree that there should have been facilities and better accommodations for the female inmates, I do think that they were correct in building facilities just for men because of the huge difference in population. Modern women especially understand of the social consequences that we still face. Being sexually exploited, having rape being an option. And even though in today's society that is something that is criminalized and is definitely, we know, shouldn't be normalization in society, during this time that we will discuss, during the late 18th century to early 19th century, these women, that was the norm, being sexually exploited. And it didn't help that the female inmates at Yuma Territorial Prison, they didn't have their separate accommodations for them. So they were with the men. And what happens naturally when you put women and men together? Well, things like pregnancy, harassment, all start to happen. So we do see that at the Yuma Territorial Prison. Unfortunately, women can also use that to their advantage. And we see that in the individual like Pearl Hart. She's a famous inmate at Yuma Territorial Prison. She's charismatic. She's what you think of a bandit, in Western United States. And she really used her looks, even though they were quite masculine, and her charismatic charm to her benefit. She flirted with the inmates and the guards, and she was just a wild figure, and that did get her help's pardon early, according to unlv.edu. I do, as a modern woman, I do counter that and say that it is wrong to use those advantages, but I do see Hart and why she did that, because in order to survive in a man's world, you got to be like one. You got to appeal to them in the way that they want to appeal. And unfortunately, a woman's body and charm is how you appeal to a man, especially in those times. So, if she can use it to her advantage to get pardoned, then you know what? Good for her. I would like to touch upon that, because these women were being held to the same standards as their fellow male inmates, they were very free to socialize with other males. We see that in modern prisons, even though they're separated by gender. Each gender socializes with the same gender. And at the case of Yuma Territorial, the few women that were there, did socialize with the men. All of the guards were men. All of the inmates were men, except maybe a few women. And this was not actually normal in the United States at the time. According to Paul Knepper, traditionally, in the Eastern prisons at the time, women and men were kept in separate facilities with the staff of their own gender, but because there was a lack of women in Arizona at the time, they didn't feel the need to accommodate to that. In consequence of the separate facilities and the lack of women staff, there were women getting pregnant, and we can't be sure that it is because of rape or if it was because of free will, but I would like to suggest, or at least bring up, that could have been a possibility. I mean, it completely makes sense, a woman being in a prison full of men, that rape shouldn't be off the table completely. But pregnancy was a thing that happened for women at the prison. Maybe not all the women, like Pearl Hart did not have a baby. when she was imprisoned. But for somebody like Manuela Fimbres, she was an inmate at Yuma Territorial Prison in 1889. She was sentenced for 15 years, and at the time of her sentencing, she was the only woman inmate. And because she was put in an environment where she was socializing with men, she ended up getting pregnant twice. And I can only imagine being pregnant in those harsh conditions, but then having to give birth in those conditions. I mean, to be fair, she is a criminal, but she is still a human being, and as a woman, I cannot imagine going through that pain, not only once, but twice in that prison. And luckily, because she did have children, she was pardoned early because there was concern over one of her children. So she did have that advantage, but I still think her situation was such a huge disadvantage because we don't know how that situation came apart, whether it was consensual or non-consensual. But also, like, being pregnant in those rough conditions is just not at all ideal, especially during the time. At Yuma Territorial Prison, women were rare, and that rarity came with its own set of dark consequences. Take Pearl Hart, for example. Known as the infamous stagecoach robber, she used her charm to manipulate guards and fellow inmates, securing herself an early pardon. It's a shocking twist, but Pearl's story isn't the norm. For most women at Yuma, the mixed gender setup led to something much more sinister, like sexual exploitation. Example I'm going to use is in the eastern prisons, because unlike the western prisons in the United States, in the eastern part, women and men were strictly separated. Yuma's female inmates were forced to socialize freely with male prisoners and staff. One haunting example is the case of Manuela Fimbres. In 1889, this young Mexican-American woman found herself alone as the only female inmate in Yuma, facing a staggering 15-year sentence. With no real boundaries between male and female prisoners, Manuela gave birth to 2 children during her time there, fathered by men inside the prison. The scandal surrounding her situation was so intense that it led to her eventual pardon, not for crimes she committed, but out of concern for the children she bore behind bars. The women of Yuma may have been few in numbers, but the stories are as unsettling as any you'll hear in the world of true crime. As we wrap up today's episode, it's important to reflect on the complex realities faced by women at Yuma Territorial Prison. Their stories remind us that history often glosses over the voices of marginalized individuals, leaving behind a fragmented narrative filled with struggles, resilience, and at times tragedy.